Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3 weeks later. Many months later. Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 2 hours later. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day. 10 seconds later. 3 days later. 1 week later. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. A few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 1 winter later. Later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. The next morning. Flashback. End of flashback. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later. Soon after. Later. Moments later.